Hello everyone. It's the end of the month, so that means that we're going to be doing a discussion video about this month's book, which is Thomas Hobbes' The Leviathan. Now, the reason I chose this book in particular is because I think it's a very important work in understanding why humans form certain types of social structures and what we can do to prevent social decline and in particular revolutionary violence, which is the time period that Thomas Hobbes lived in, which was during the English Civil War. And Thomas Hobbes was a pretty passive guy, very peace-loving person, and did not want to get involved with any of this senseless warfare. So his entire thesis is an explanation of why revolution in particular is not the greatest thing in the world. Now, there are some things that I disagree on with Hobbes, and I'll go into that, and I'll explain the best parts of the book and some of the key concepts that we need to keep in mind going forward. This is not a one-stop shop for right-wing political theory, but is an important foundational text in understanding some of the later concepts or some of the other concepts that I've talked about previously in some of my other videos. So let's get right into it. Now, summarizing this book in one sentence: freedom or security? That is the fundamental question. Now, Thomas Hobbes was a proponent or predecessor to the thought of contractarianism, which is essentially a system where all of society is based or should be based on contracts between rational, self-interested, free persons. This is also the basis of his moral system, which is sort of a predecessor to moral skepticism in some senses, and that morality is essentially what people will agree upon. Now, this is the idea of social norms. Now, I have a slightly different view on the totality of morals and what moral codes are, and some things that you may consider universal or things that you should try and apply universally within your society, but that's a different discussion in and of itself. But it's important to understand what his moral system is, and how this is a foundational text in understanding some of the more modern, individualistic moral codes that we understand today, which is moral skepticism. So for Hobbes and many people like myself, the ideal society really is formed on the concept of cooperative effort, which is rationally better than non-cooperative effort. Now, non-cooperative effort would be something like theft, for example. We cannot cooperate with one another if we're stealing from one another. If we're murdering each other, we are not working cooperatively. And cooperation between people really leads to productivity, safety, technology, all of these very wonderful things. But why contracts? And I'd like to make sure you understand that this is not a literal contract, something where two people sign. It's more of an abstract idea, although it could be physical contracts, but think of it more in the abstract sense of we come together and we agree to do X, Y, or Z, or we agree not to do X, Y, or Z in order to cooperate with one another. But when we ask the question, why contracts? Well, contracts or agreements between persons are a necessity to preventing the natural state of man from emerging. Now, this is a core fundamental concept that Hobbes touches on in the Leviathan, is the state of man or the state of nature. And the state of nature for humans is violent and unproductive. And I believe he mentioned that it's the same pretty much everywhere, that the natural state of things are violent and unproductive. And that humans in particular are fallen or fallible creatures. And unless we help one another, we form these cooperative efforts, we have to be tamed by social structure in order to be productive, in order to be secure, in order to really secure our existence. And this idea is the basis of the social contract theory. However, when I say that, lots of people like to get triggered on this whole thing, especially ANCAPs or libertarians, but the Hobbesian contract theory or social contract theory is much different from the Lockean or Rousseauan version of the social contract theory. Now, they all kind of build off of one another, and I do like some aspects of this. In fact, the social contract theory is an explanation, it's a rationalization of the legitimacy of the state and why we need this state in order to secure our existence in the first place. It's also a way of understanding the implied cooperative effort between persons when we come together in a society. You may not know it, you may do it subconsciously, but you have agreed to not do X or do X in cooperation with one another in the name of unity in order to be productive, in order to secure your existence, your survival. But really, this social contract theory really helps explain or maybe answer the question of freedom or security. And a social contract, it's just this implied agreement between persons. And of course, the state is made up of persons if we're talking about governance here. So now Hobbes goes on to explain why humans have formed a state, and really comes down to the agreement historically between one person's and another. And essentially, some people give up some of their naturally occurring rights in order to gain security of some kind. Now, I don't know if he really knew exactly what history was like way back in the day, as we understand it now, or what, but the way that I understand it, and this is similar to his way of thinking, is that in the past, during the tribal age, during the prehistoric or the Neolithic or the Paleolithic, whatever, certain groups of individuals will band together. You could call it a tribe or something like that. They will give up their naturally occurring abilities or rights to kind of do as they please in order to secure their existence. They come together as a collective group with collective interest, and this really helps protect themselves. It helps them to survive. So when you have a whole bunch of people kind of grouped together, they can form stronger militaries, they can be more effective, they're essentially unified in what direction they're headed in life, and this can lead to a much more secure existence than it could previously. And if you look at the example, or the historical example of how city-states were formed, how nations were formed, this is essentially what happened. There's some other details, but one particular tribe might be extremely powerful, and they might have like a castle or something like that. And a whole bunch of other people come to them and say, hey, we will give up our rights in order for you to protect us with your army. We will pay you tax, we will send you sons for the army, and in exchange, we get to live inside the walls of your city. And as the city grows larger and larger, eventually you end up with states. And this is the historical analysis of why we have states in the first place. It is a natural offshoot of man's wantingness for security of some kind, because the natural world is a very dangerous and violent place, as Hobbes points out. Now, what is very interesting about this book and Hobbes' way of thinking in particular is the history, or his life story, essentially. He was trained in the church, he was educated by the church, as were most educated men at the time. They were educated through the church. But when he was done, instead of going into the clergy like so many educated men did, he went into the natural sciences, sort of the pre-Renaissance natural sciences field of study. In particular, I think he was focused on physics. And of course, physics is essentially the study of natural law. And what he does when he comes to politics, when he wrote Leviathan, he was already 67 years old, I believe. So he had a long time studying and writing about physics. But what he did is that he applied his understanding of the natural world, of natural law, and applied it to politics. Very similar in the way that I do this and many other nationalists do this nowadays. And this understanding of how humans naturally interact with the world around them and how they interact with each other, their behavior, this sociocultural understanding, is very important if you want to have a stable society, a stable system of governance. Now, in accordance with this scientific and historical knowledge of how humans form states and how the state is legitimate and it's a natural offshoot of the human condition, he understood and argues that the state must consider the health of society before the individual. This sort of collective thought is very key in understanding some aspects of right-wing political spheres. This concept of collective power in particular is the key difference between someone like an anarchist or a libertarian or some type of centrist versus the more extremes of both political sides, where we understand that collective power is always greater than that of the individual, and that the protection of this collective interest is only natural. It is a naturally occurring phenomena that it has helped us get to where we are today. Now, the difference between the left and the right in particular is the interaction of hierarchy. The left seeks to destroy hierarchy, the right seeks to uphold hierarchy. Now, the right has the natural approach, in which we understand the natural human condition, the natural condition of the world itself, is that there will always be hierarchy, and to tear this down is to fundamentally destroy human social behavior. Now, as far as the actual form of government is concerned, Hobbes is in favor and argues for the powerful central authority, sort of an autocracy, very much like a monarchy. That is his preferred system of governance, because he talks about the state of man and how that we must have, it necessitates a strong central authority in order to maintain order in society. In order to protect our interests, we must have a strong central authority. But there is a key difference between someone like myself and Hobbes in this understanding, and in particular our worldviews. And we're separated by several hundred years of history, but he essentially makes the claim that we must be subservient to this central authority, no matter what. And of course, this is because he has experienced the English Civil War, as we've talked about. He was living in exile, afraid of being assassinated for political reasons. And many of the royalists interpreted his works as being anti-monarchist, which is very funny considering he's explicitly advocating for a strong central authority. But however, the difference between us is that when it comes to the obligations of the rights of the state, the legitimacy of the state, it is legitimate only insofar as it is serving the interest of the people, that is upholding social order. So when it comes to the topic of revolution, I have to side somewhere closer to the Lockean concept of revolution, that it is the rights of the people to revolt against a state that is not serving their interest. But one key caveat in this entire explanation: I believe that in times of absolute dire need, if the central authority is failing to serve the interest of the people beneath it, now of course the state is made up of persons, the power of the state is determined by how many people it has beneath it, who is productive, what their army is like. I don't see the government as an extension of the people in the egalitarian sense, which is to say that government is derived from the people per se. It's a complex topic, but essentially, in times of dire need like that we're facing today, changing the central authority is extremely important in order to preserve our interest. Because the state has failed its obligation to the social contract, we have the moral authority to break away from it and change the government and dispose of whatever system we're living under in order to secure our existence. So while I agree in the concept of a central authority, and I agree that we must observe and recognize the legitimacy of this authority, there come times where you have to question it in order to preserve your future, which is similar to what we are experiencing today, as I said. Now, this has been a very short synopsis of a very lengthy and well-written and inspiring book, but there's only so much I can cover, and I would prefer to touch on the political theory side of it. However, I did greatly enjoy the opening chapters where Hobbes talks about the rationality of man and sort of consciousness and how we perceive things. Very interesting to read that type of material. But if you have a different opinion from me, if you'd like to point out anything, if you'd like to lay down any quotes or ask any questions about a particular subject, please leave me a comment down below. I look forward to your discussion. Thanks for listening.